All right. So we're going to talk about Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, the very popular, very famous, iconic poem by Dylan Thomas. Um, so 70 years since the publication of the poem earlier this year. It is a poem that remains tremendously popular. It's a poem that a lot of people memorize. It's a poem that shows up in a lot of popular media, movies, television shows, popular music, and so forth. And so um, there's something really compelling about the poem. It's also a poem that, despite its popularity and familiarity for a lot of people, defies sort of close interpretation. We have a sense, of course, that it is a poem about death, and it is a poem about defying death, and it is very literally a poem of a young man, youngish man, an adult man, but young, speaking to his elderly father, not to die, right? So it's a very powerful poem. It is a poem of death. We've seen some poems of death already. We'll see more, but this one is a rebellious poem of death. So in it, the poet urges us not to go gentle into the good night. Right? The first stanza of the poem: do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day, rage, rage against the dying of the light. So it is a poem that urges us to resist death and to not to not have this sort of peaceful, quiet passing. That feels very contrary to the popular sentiment that we have now as modern people to go to loved ones and say it's okay, you can go, to try to put them at ease. This is a young man passionately pleading with his father not to leave, and I think that resonates with a lot of people, because even if it's not what we say on the deathbed or in that deathbed scene, it is oftentimes, right, what is in our heart. And so that makes it a very potent poem. So we see that basically theme established there in the first stanza. In the final stanza, we get the direct address to the father. And in the four intervening stanzas, we get sort of variations on a theme, I guess is a good way to put it. And they focus on different types of men. So they focus, stanza 2 focuses on wise men. Stanza 3 focuses on good men. Stanza 4 focuses on wild men. And stanza 5 focuses on grave men. And so we have these sort of qualities of men. So just real quick, because language matters, right? It is, of course, about a son addressing his father. So in that regard, there is something masculine about the poem. And so we see the word men. It certainly has a masculine sense to it, but I don't think that we need to read the poem that way, and I don't know that Thomas necessarily meant us to only read the poem in the context of men. I think it applies across gender lines, and so you can think of that as sort of a general gender neutral kind of term in that regard. So I don't think it's exclusive. I think it's very difficult when you sit down and try and look at individual images within the poem to try and analyze them too much, to try to figure out exactly what the image has to do with the particular type of man or something like that. And part of that is because this is how Dylan Thomas, how his mind sort of works. and I think also because it is a poem that is supposed to be in a moment of distress, of emotional, psychological, mental turmoil, it's a mistake to think that you can make clear literal sense of every image in the poem. The idea is to think about the force of the language, and I think that's what's really important. And there's some interesting things that I want to point out to you here in this brief lecture. So the first thing is it's a poem of tremendous energy. There are a lot of verbs and a lot of variation on verbs, but they tend to be verbs of extreme energy, even violence. And so I think if we just take a quick catalog of those, as we move through the poem, you have words go, burn, rave, rage, dying, forked lightning, you have wave, crying, danced, caught, sang, flight, grieved, blaze, curse, bless, pray, right? And there are a lot of repetition of some of these. Rage, of course, shows up again and again and again. Go shows up again and again and again. So there's a lot of energy in those words. So as you read the poem and you get these words, there is the repetition, of course, of rage and of go, and they alternate, which is very interesting, right? So we get this alternation of go, or particularly do not go, right? And rage. Do not go, rage. Do not go, rage. Do not go, rage. Back and forth. And interspersed between them are words that help us keep the energy, whether it's dying, whether it's lightning, whether it's wave, whether it's dance, right? And so you can find these verbs interspersed between that repetition throughout the poem, and that keeps the energy going throughout the poem. So that what you take away when you read the poem or hear it read is that there's a tremendous amount of energy, and that it is a sort of violent poem, right? That this is an energy that is difficult to contain. But there is also a tension, right? There is a tension between what the poet sees as the natural, natural is not the best word, conventional, maybe, is a better word than natural, because natural suggests it's the way it should be. I think conventional, right? So there's this tension between what the poet sees as the conventional approach to death, which is to go gentle, and to view death as the good knight, right? Which is, of course, a play on the metaphor of death as sleep, which is a very ancient metaphor. And so there is the tension between that conventional idea and what the poet feels, which is to rage against it, right? And again, then what we have in here, if we want to look for a central metaphor, is the idea of this contrast between dark and light. So you have life represented as light, as day, right? And you have death represented as night, or the end of that day. There is also in that a symbolic connection between the intellect or knowledge, awareness, consciousness as light, and ignorance or metaphorical blindness as darkness, which then is really reiterated later when we have the stanza about those who see with blinding sight and blind eyes. And that really harkens back to and is a very sort of loose literary allusion back to Plato's allegory of the cave. And so if you haven't read Plato's allegory of the cave, this is one of those sort of foundational texts a lot of literature draws on, and it really establishes that metaphor of light versus dark in terms of enlightenment, right? Intellectual knowledge and self-awareness versus ignorance. So those all become very, very important throughout the poem. So there is sort of a literal death, there is a metaphorical or intellectual or even cultural death that could be spoken to in the poem. So it applies to situations that may not be literal death without losing a lot of its force, right? So it can be applied to lots of social situations where maybe we want to say someone is blind to a situation, whether it's social injustice, racial injustice, whatever it is, religious oppressions, or it could be just about anything. And if you want to have something symbolic and say that people are blind to this issue or the importance of the issue or the effects of the issue, then you can use these metaphors, and you could turn to a poem like this that is in a very literal sense about the dying of a father, and it becomes metaphorically about the dying of an idea. So it's got broad applications. I think one of the really interesting things is to go through and realize that there are a couple of what appear to be sort of almost supernatural images in the poem. So we have forked lightning in the second stanza. We have a green bay in the third stanza, which has this sort of weird luminescent feel, as though like there's some sort of portal under the water or something into a supernatural realm that glows green. And you've seen things like that in movies probably, but it's referenced in older poems like Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and even further back than that. We have wild men worshiping the sun, which is another sort of celestial event. And we have blazing meteors. So in every stanza, there is some kind of a supernatural, celestial event that seems to function like a portent, right? Like that ancient people would have seen, an eclipse or a meteor, or a glowing green bay, whether that's a light that comes out of the water or whether that's a reference to something like the Aurora Borealis. That they would have seen these things, even lightning sometimes, as sort of celestial or supernatural signs or omens or portents, a lot of times associated with death or doom or something apocalyptic. And the idea here being that good men face this, wild men have faced this, right? Wise men have faced this, grave men have faced this. All kinds of people throughout time have faced these things and somehow persisted. Right? That every time it was believed to be the end of the world and the end of humanity, the end of civilization, that there was a next group. There was another chapter in the book. There was another day to follow through with the metaphor that Dylan Thomas sets up. And he is suggesting here that it's because we did not go gentle, right? That we didn't just lay down as a species or as a civilization, a society, a people, and say, well, that's the end. We raged against it. We said, no, it's not the end. There will be another day. We will find a way. And it was a sort of act of will. Now, we recognize in the end of it, there's a futility. It is a curse and a blessing, mortality, right? And he couples those two ideas together right at the very end for the first time. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light. but that's it, right? It ends. There is a finiteness to human existence that even though you have this cycle of raging and continuing on, there is an irony to the poem in that there will be an end. At some point, the rage against the dying of the light will simply be in futility. And I think there are other fun things in the poem as well. You have some puns. For example, grave men near death, which is a pun, right? It's in the middle of this very serious, intense, powerful poem, and I think it's supposed to be funny. Darkly, weirdly funny, but grave men near death, men near the grave, but also serious, severe men, right? There's an irony to the wise men. Knowing that dark is right, but they don't go gentle into the good night, right? If you look at the grammatical structure there, though wise men at their inn know dark is right, do not go gentle into that good night, right? So there's an irony in it, like the wisdom of knowing of what is right and not doing it, and good men raging, so there's a lot of fun wordplay in the poem. I think the best hope for reading and understanding it is to choose some of these images, look at patterns, listen to sounds, look for energy, but to try to connect it all in a way that makes kind of logical sense doesn't always work, because that's not the way the poet was thinking about the subject, and it's not the way that our brains function when we're faced with this kind of distress, which is what Dylan Thomas is trying to recreate through the poem.